It often happens in a small, ordinary exchange. Someone asks a question that sounds simple. Why did you do that? Why didn't you say anything? Why are you like this? The question is polite, but it carries an expectation. An explanation is supposed to follow. You feel the moment stretch, not because you don't have an answer, but because you don't feel the need to give one. Inside, there is no urgency, no rush to fix the silence. You've explained yourself many times before. You know how it goes. You choose your words carefully, you soften the edges, you try to sound reasonable. You watch the other person nod, not because they understand, but because you've done what's expected. This time, you don't do that. The silence feels heavier than words at first. Your body notices it, a slight tightness, a small alertness. Not fear, more like awareness. You're aware that something is missing from the script. The other person waits. Their face changes just a little. They might smile, they might laugh. They might repeat the question in a different way. You stay quiet. It's not an act. You're not trying to prove anything. You simply don't feel like translating yourself into something easier for them to hold. Inside, there's a strange mix of calm and tension. Calm because you're not bending. Tension because you know silence can make people uncomfortable. You notice how quickly silence is filled by others, how explanation is treated like kindness, like proof that you're open, honest, safe. When you don't explain, the moment feels exposed, like a light turned on in a room no one meant to examine. You're still there, still listening, still present, but you're not offering yourself up for interpretation. This isn't about hiding. You're not avoiding the truth. You're simply not handing it over on demand. The pause grows, not long, just long enough to be noticed. Later, when you're alone, you think about it, not with pride, not with regret, just curiosity. You notice how steady you felt when you didn't rush to explain. There was no anger in it, no coldness, just a quiet line you didn't cross. Not explaining yourself didn't feel like withdrawal. It felt like staying where you were. And that small moment, barely visible to anyone else, is where this episode begins. Jung would begin by turning inward and asking what silence feels like from the inside before anyone reacts to it. Not the silence forced on you, but the silence you choose. When you don't explain yourself, the first thing you may feel is tension in the body, a small tightening, a readiness. Not because you're afraid, but because you're used to filling space. You've learned that words smooth things over. They keep you safe. So when you don't speak, your body notices. Your breathing changes slightly. Your attention sharpens. You become aware of yourself in the moment. Jung would say this is where something important is happening, not outside, but inside. Silence is not empty here. It's active. It's a decision your inner life is making before your mind explains it. You might notice a calm underneath the tension, a sense of staying with yourself instead of leaving to meet someone else's comfort. Not explaining can feel like standing still while the urge to move passes by. There is often a fear that comes next, not a loud one, a quiet question. What if they misunderstand me? What if they think I'm cold? What if silence costs me something? Jung would notice that this fear doesn't mean your silence is wrong. It means you're touching a boundary. Boundaries often bring fear because they separate inside from outside. When you explain yourself too quickly, you cross that boundary. You give away what's still forming. You trade clarity for relief. Silence lets something stay unfinished. It protects the part of you that doesn't want to be shaped by someone else's reaction. Inside, this can feel steady, grounded, like keeping your feet where they are instead of stepping forward automatically. Jung would say this is not withdrawal, it's containment. You're holding something, not hiding it. You may notice that your silence doesn't feel aggressive, it doesn't push, it simply doesn't open. That can be uncomfortable if you're used to being understood through words. Silence asks you to trust your inner sense without proof. Over time, this kind of silence can feel like self-respect. Not because you're above anyone, but because you're listening inward instead of outward. Jung would remind us that the inner life needs space to speak in its own way. Sometimes that way has no words yet. When you don't explain yourself, you're not refusing connection. You're refusing to abandon what you haven't finished understanding inside. And that quiet holding is where the boundary lives. Nietzsche would notice how quickly silence gets a story attached to it. Not your silence, the story other people tell themselves when you don't explain. In many conversations, explaining yourself is treated as proof of good character. It signals openness, cooperation, trust. When you speak, others feel settled. When you don't, something loosens. Nietzsche would say this is not about truth, it's about comfort. Explanations make people feel safe because they turn uncertainty into something familiar. So when you choose not to explain yourself, your silence is rarely heard as neutral. It is read, interpreted, filled in. Some people assume guilt. If you don't explain, you must be hiding something. Others assume arrogance. If you don't explain, you must think you're above them. Nietzsche would smile at this. He would notice how quickly silence becomes a mirror. People don't hear what you mean, they hear what they fear. The story says a good person makes themselves easy to understand. A good person smooths things out. A good person answers questions when they are asked. So when you don't, the story becomes uneasy. It looks for reasons. You're being difficult, you're cold, you're passive-aggressive. Nietzsche would say, these labels are not observations, they are defenses. They protect the belief that everyone should be available for explanation. Because if silence is allowed, then explanation becomes a choice, not a duty. And that makes people nervous. Nietzsche would also notice how silence removes leverage. When you explain, you give others something to work with. They can agree, disagree, correct you, shape you. When you stay quiet, that access disappears. And access is what people often expect, even if they don't name it that way. So your silence feels disruptive, not loud, just unsettling. It doesn't play along. Nietzsche would say, the pressure to explain is not about understanding you, it's about keeping the rules clear. Speak when spoken to, justify yourself, make sense on demand. When you don't do that, you quietly step outside the script. And stepping outside a script often looks threatening, even when nothing aggressive is happening. Nietzsche would remind us that many values survive only because they are repeated without question. Silence interrupts repetition. By not explaining yourself, you're not trying to teach anyone a lesson. You're not making a statement. You're simply not participating in a story that says your inner life is always available for inspection. And that's why silence, in this case, is not emptiness, it's refusal. Not loud, not dramatic, just clear. Arendt would pay attention to what happens between people when you stop explaining yourself. Not inside you and not in big ideas, but in small social moments where expectations quietly live. In everyday life, explanation is treated like a basic courtesy. You explain so others feel at ease. You explain so things move smoothly. You explain so no one has to sit with uncertainty for too long. When you don't explain, that rhythm breaks. Not loudly, just enough to be felt. A pause stretches, someone fills it. Someone else looks away. Arendt would notice how quickly silence becomes uncomfortable in shared spaces. Not because it's harmful, but because it interrupts what people expect from each other. Most social life runs on unspoken agreements. We answer when asked, we clarify when misunderstood. We smooth over tension with words. These habits keep things predictable. When you don't explain yourself, you step out of that habit. You don't argue, you don't refuse openly. You simply don't participate in the ritual. That's when pressure appears, not as force, as repetition. People ask again in a softer way, or in a joking way, or later when others are around. They're not trying to control you, they're trying to restore the familiar flow. Arendt would say this is how conformity works in ordinary life. No one commands it, Everyone maintains it together. Silence stands out because it doesn't give the group what it expects. It doesn't help others place you. It doesn't confirm shared understanding. You may notice how quickly your quiet becomes a topic, not spoken directly to you, but around you. People wonder what it means. They fill in reasons. Arendt would observe that explanation is often demanded not for truth, but for reassurance. Words calm the group. Silence leaves things open. When you hold your silence, you're not trying to make a point, but the group feels challenged anyway because the usual signals are missing. This can lead to subtle changes. You may be included less in certain conversations, or included with more caution. People don't know how much access they have to you anymore. Arendt would say that social life prefers visibility. When intentions are visible, behavior feels manageable. Silence removes that visibility. That's why silence as a boundary can feel heavy in groups, not because it's wrong, but because it resists being absorbed. You're still there, still present, still listening. You just aren't offering yourself up for shared comfort. And that quiet choice, made again and again, is how silence becomes a boundary in the social world. Machiavelli would look at what follows silence, not at why it was chosen. He would watch what changes once people realize you are not going to explain yourself, not today, not later. At first, nothing obvious happens, conversations continue, people still speak to you, life keeps moving. Silence doesn't cause a scene, it rarely does. But slowly, the ground shifts. When you don't explain yourself, people stop feeling sure about how to handle you. They don't know how much access they have. They don't know which questions are welcome. That uncertainty makes people careful. Machiavelli would say this is where power moves quietly, not through force, but through adjustment. People change their behavior to regain control of the situation. You may notice that others speak around you more than to you. Decisions are made without checking in. Assumptions replace conversations. It's not hostile, it's efficient. Silence removes leverage. When you don't explain, you don't give people material to work with. They can't argue with you, they can't persuade you, they can't correct you. So they adapt. Some people step back, others step in more firmly, filling the space you leave open. Silence creates room, and someone usually occupies it. Machiavelli would notice how quickly silence is reinterpreted as position. You are seen as distant, or guarded, or difficult, not because you said so, but because you didn't deny it. This can cost you things, not dramatically, quietly. Fewer invitations, less influence, less assumption that you'll play along. At the same time, silence protects you. You keep your inner life intact. Your reasons stay yours. You are harder to move, harder to pull. Machiavelli would say every choice has a price. Speaking has a price. Silence has one too. The difference is who pays it. When you explain yourself, you often pay with energy, with clarity, with parts of yourself shaped by others. When you don't, you may pay with closeness, with ease, with smooth access. Neither is right or wrong. They are effects. Over time, people learn where you stand, not because you told them, but because you didn't. The boundary becomes real through repetition. Machiavelli would respect that. He wouldn't call it kind or unkind. He would call it effective. Silence, used this way, changes the field. It rearranges who approaches you, how they do it, and what they expect to receive. You don't announce the boundary. You don't defend it. You let it work.